Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every Friday, so don't forget to subscribe and press the alert button so you'll know what's going on every week.
And if you have a burning horticultural
Uh-oh.
question for Stephen Ryan, do put it in the comments below, and every Monday we do a short where you, not I, will answer them.
And I'll do my very best. And don't forget to add context for me by telling me where you're from. And of course, if you're a keen gardener and you live anywhere in Australia, can I recommend that you join the Royal Horticultural Society of Victoria? They have a wonderful gazette that comes out every quarter. Yours truly writes for it. And they have all sorts of fabulous events and things going on throughout the year. So a very worthwhile organisation.
The Stephen Ryan PR channel. But Stephen, I'm sensing familiar territory.
We are here again. Yes, we're at Gentiana Nursery at Olinda in the Dandenongs. We've been here several times before, but there's always something different that we want to engage with in Craig's fabulous nursery.
And Craig Wilson is the owner of Gentiana. So what are we going to look at today of his?
All right, well, it's a group of woodland plants that I've always been very fond of.
Yes.
And have become something of a collector's piece, and there's lots of people out there breeding them at the moment and creating new cultivars, and that's a genus called Epimedium.
Ah, Epimedium. Right, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
They are quite au courant, aren't they?
People... They are. They're very, very of the day. People want them. And of course, that means that breeders are going to get to work on them, and they're looking at all sorts of different ways of improving or adding variety to this group of plants, which actually consists in the wild of only about 64 species.
Okay, well, if people want them, we should tell them about them.
Yes, that's where we're going to go today, I assure you.
Let's go and have a look.
All right.
All right, Stephen, now here's an array at Gentiana. Now, I guess the first question for everyone is going to be, where are Epimediums from?
All right. Well, they've got a really weird, disjointed sort of distribution.
Okay.
One assumes that climatic zones have changed over the millennium, and so there are a small group of them that come all the way from over in Algiers, so
Yes.
northern Africa.
Yeah.
Then there's a whole section of them that grow through the sort of Mediterranean, around Turkey, into the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then there's another gap. And then there's another whole group of them. In fact, I would say almost the epicenter of the genus.
The epicenter of Epimedium, Stephen.
Yes, and that comes from China and Japan.
Right.
So they are well spread in the Northern Hemisphere, which also means that there is quite a bit of diversity amongst them, both in the visual side of things and also about the requirements of the different plants.
Okay. Any Southern Hemisphere? Any in Australia? No.
No.
So
Well, only the ones we're brought in.
So what are the characteristics of an Epimedium?
All right, well, they're a rooting perennial, so they're a sort of a rhizomatous perennial that will make various size clumps depending on the species. Some of them run quite a way and make quite big drifts.
Yeah.
Others are more restrained and clump forming.
Yeah.
There is both evergreen and deciduous species. And the flower colour can vary from pure white through yellows to apricots, and then on to cerises, reds, all sorts of different colours in them, burgundies. Many of them have bicolour flowers as well, so you can have white and purple, or you can have...
Oh, I like this one.
Yeah, well, that one's a subtle bicolour, but some of them have quite distinctly different coloured floral parts. So some of them will have burgundy sort of spurs on them and a white petal-type top on it, so you can have a quite distinctly bicolour in some of them. And they vary from quite little plants that'll only grow to probably 6 inches tall, maybe like that one, which is one of the forms of grandiflorum called Album Nanum, which means white and small. Well, it does, it's
Very
quite
literal.
literally. Up to some quite tall ones. There are a couple of the Chinese and Japanese ones that can get up to near enough to a metre or so tall.
Now, so a question, in relation to them being deciduous or not, so herbaceous perennials or not, is a particular region where the evergreen ones are they the Mediterranean ones, or is it mixed?
In general, the Mediterranean ones do tend to be more evergreen.
Yep.
And once you get into the Chinese and Japanese ones, they're not always, but sometimes herbaceous and die down in the winter. So it does vary depending on where they come from. I guess it's a climatic adaptation for particular areas. I guess the biggest difference between the Mediterranean and the Asian is actually their drought tolerance. more than anything.
So this is the interesting thing, because I would have assumed that they were a moist woodland plant, and obviously some of them are.
Oh yes, yeah, quite a number of the Asian ones do in fact come from damp, cool woodlands growing on the sides of forest streams and all that sort of thing. So quite obviously those plants, although very cold hardy, aren't particularly drought tolerant. So some of the epimediums do need a reasonably constantly moist, not wet, but they just need to have that little bit of moisture the whole time. Whereas some of the, particularly the Mediterranean ones, Colchica and its ilk, are very good in dry root infested shade. So they will actually cope with quite low moisture levels.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think we've kind of done the basics. Why don't we go and look at Craig's garden and just go and look at how he's used them in the garden and some tips about using them in your landscaping.
What a good idea.
So, Stephen, this seems to be the most beautiful sort of woodland walk.
Oh, yes.
So, what are the ideal growing conditions in a garden for epimediums?
All right. Well, if all epimediums had their trubbers, they would select a light area without very much, if any, direct sunlight.
Yeah.
So high canopy, plenty of light getting in. They would select a nice, humus-rich, heavily mulched soil. Works really well for them. If they can get a little bit of moisture right through the summer months, even the drought-tolerant ones will look better and grow better if, in fact, they get a little bit of moisture.
Yeah.
And they will make lovely mats that you can mix in amongst other woodland plants. Particularly the evergreen ones are really useful around the more ephemeral woodlanders.
So this is the thing, they make a great evergreen ground cover, the evergreen ones, obviously.
Yeah, yes, obviously. So you could use the epimediums with your trilliums,
Yes.
with your little wood anemones, which are now called anemonoides, nemerosa, and any of those other sort of woodlandy plants, including your woodland bulbs too. I mean, your cyclamen, your galanthuses, all those things that like a woodlandy conditions. The epimediums will make a lovely foil for them.
So let's talk specifics. Funnily enough, the tree that we are under is...
Yeah, Davidia involucrata.
Which we've made a video about, so we'll show you that. Obviously, it's deciduous.
Yeah.
So we've made a film about hostas in the past here, and one of your points was deciduous leaves falling to create mulch and humus and blah, blah, blah.
Self-perpetuating, so you're putting it back like it would be in nature.
So could you grow epimediums in evergreen shade?
All right, well, some of them, yes. But I would say most of them would do better in deciduous shade.
Yeah.
Mainly because evergreen shade's inclined to create a rather heavier canopy than most of them would enjoy. And also, of course, as the leaves drop, which they will do from an evergreen tree as well as a deciduous one, just not at the same time of the year or perhaps in the same quantity. The leaves are hard, dry, and they stay there forever.
Yes.
So deciduous trees are far better from that perspective because they'll quickly rot down and turn into humus, and your epimediums and other woodland dwellers will thank you.
So actually, echoing a lot of what we spoke about in our hosta video, which we obviously will link, and thank you again, Craig, for letting us talk about your hostas. So basically they can grow side by side. Even you were pointing out the Mediterranean ones. So that surprises me.
Yeah, well, the Mediterranean ones just have this ability to be even more drought tolerant, but it's not necessarily what they would prefer. They've just evolved in a drier climate where they've had to put up with that. If they got some nice moist woodland conditions, they could almost romp. So they, they could almost, well, I doubt
romping epimedium.
Yeah, they probably would never become weedy per se, but you could end up with very large colonies of them. A lot of the Japanese and Chinese ones tend to be slightly more clumpy, and so therefore are not as likely to take off. And so they'll just make sort of neat plants within your woodland garden.
All right. But I think one of the things we should now just look at is the huge variety of leaves and how you can use the leaf both in spring and in autumn and as an evergreen in your garden plant.
Yeah, good.
So Stephen, a beautiful woodland setting. Yes. Let's talk how we would use the different types of leaves. So what have you got there?
I have been allowed by Craig to go around and pick
just not block me out.
Oh, sorry. A bouquet. And we have got here some of the remarkable foliage forms that you can get in the Epimedium genus.
Yeah.
So when you look at these leaves, you can see these are all fresh spring leaves on these bits I picked. Some of them will be just straight green.
Yeah.
Some will be amazing shades of copper and burgundy. Some will have sort of the most amazing liver spots all over the leaves. Look at that one there, isn't that just
Amazing. Yeah, yeah,
remarkable.
yeah.
Some people think there's a disease going on there, but there's not. That's quite natural. And some will have sort of coppery sort of veining through them and markings through them. So you can see that there's a huge diversity in the leaf, both in colour and also in shape and size. So for a comparatively small genus of only some 66 species that have been recognised, the diversity is huge. And I might add, of course, there's breeders playing with them all the time.
Yeah.
So there's going to be new hybrids coming out virtually weekly.
And I think the thing that I noticed too is the huge variety of leaf size
Yep.
and shape and colour, obviously. But the new foliage on some is really, really vibrant and very different.
Yeah, and as it ages, it will. It'll go to a straighter green look. So you get that seasonal change going through. So it's not just about flowers.
And does some colour at the end of the season?
Oh yes, there's many of them, particularly some of the more evergreeny ones.
Yeah.
That will blush with red or orange or yellow when the cold comes in the autumn, and they'll often hold that colour right through till the end of winter.
So the thing, I guess, about woodland gardens is because many of those plants are ephemeral or herbaceous, the epimediums can bridge that gap when not much is going on,
Wonderful at it. So
to give you foliage rather than
so
flowers.
you've got that foliage, and I have to say, if I were breeding epimediums, it would be, and I don't have the time to enter into that little rabbit hole, I don't think, but if I were breeding epimediums, I think foliage would be my prime consideration to get really interesting variations in leaf shape, size, and also height, so that some would be much taller than others. So I'd like to get even more height variation within the group. And then the flowers, as beautiful as they are, I would like them to have lovely flowers, obviously. I mean, you've got Hot Lips there with its bright pink flowers on it, and sutchuenense there with its burgundy and white flowers. Those.
And this little tiny one.
Oh, stellulatum with its fabulous little tiny white flowers and its beautiful liver-spotted new leaves on it.
So that's that one there.
Yeah, so really, really interesting and diverse varieties in them. And there's one we haven't engaged with, and look at the flowers on that. That one is wushanense, and its new leaves have that amazing sort of bronze marbling through it, and these beautiful dense flower spikes of pale yellow. Really pretty. Now that one's quite a tall one as well. It'll get up to 18 inches or so in height, so it's one of the taller ones and is being very popularly used for breeding these days.
And actually, I would say the sort of the sparseness of the flowers on this and the denseness of the flowers on that, it's markedly different.
Oh, yes.
That's quite striking because they're quite sort of, I guess, delicate flowers. The flowers don't leap out at you. Like a trillium flower is really bold and stands out, whereas these are much more sort of ethereal, I suppose.
Yes, they are. They're very dainty little flowers, but there's more than enough interest in the group to entertain any gardener, no matter how big their garden is. And it always astounds me that a group like Epimedium, with all of the diversity in such a small group of plants, hasn't taken off in the same way as, say, for instance, say, snowdrops. You know, you've got a basically series of plants that have green and white flowers, sometimes green or sometimes yellowy green and white flowers. Some are double, some are single. They all have a similarity about them. You can't mistake a snowdrop.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that you're not a snowdrop fan.
Well, I like them, but I like big drifts of one or two. I don't need every known cultivar because I can't tell the difference between quite a number. But these, the Epimediums, have such diversity in their group that I think they're definitely worth collecting.
Now, we have, with Craig's permission, just picked some.
Randomly.
Do they last as a cut flower?
Not terribly well.
Right.
You get a few days out of them. The foliage would actually last longer than the flowers would. So if you wanted to cut them as foliage, they'd be fantastic.
And some of them would be amazing. Well, you alluded to pots and alluded to growing them in other conditions. So why don't we go and look at some of Craig's potted epimediums and just talk about pot culture?
All right, good idea.
Stephen, let's talk pot culture because we have this fabulous epimedium in a fabulous sort of celadon pot. So do they make, obviously they do, good pot plants?
They can, particularly the evergreen ones.
Yeah.
I always have some reservations about deciduous plants or herbaceous plants in pots, I have to say, because you really need to have a place where you can put them away where you're not looking at them when they're over. And Craig has very cleverly got this actually in a nursery pot. No, it's not cheating. It's actually a really good idea. It's what he does with his hostas as well. He keeps them in an ordinary nursery pot. When they've gone over or they're not really all that interesting at a particular time of the year,
Yeah.
he can take it out, use the pot for something else, and so you can recycle it all the time.
But if you were going to only grow them in pots, as probably I will for quite some time, what are the things you should bear in mind?
All right, well, they don't mind being a bit root bound, but a bit like hostas, they need to be kept reasonably well watered and fed a little bit
Yeah.
when they're in pots. So you can have quite a big clumpy plant in a comparatively small pot.
Yeah.
Of course, you can always divide them. So if they do get really thick in a pot, you can divide them up, and we'll talk about that as well.
Now, did you say they're rhizomatous?
Yes, they have a creeping rhizome, which in many cases can be quite woody. So it can be quite a thick, hard, heavy rhizome, and they tend to grow in amongst each other. So they can tend to get quite congested, and they can be quite difficult to divide. They're not just one of those plants you can pull apart with your hands as a rule.
I was going to say, can you just be brutal and kind of chop them with a spade, or do you have to get bits that have got nodes? And
I personally often use a serrated bread knife.
Ah, right.
And I'll just go through a clump with a bread knife, cutting through rhizomes willy-nilly. But I do try and get a decent little clump with each plant that I pull out. By just having one rhizome in a pot, it takes quite a long time to build up enough oomph to be a respectable looking plant.
Like this?
Yeah, now if I had a plant like this, I would probably only divide that into half a dozen pieces.
Oh, that's quite a lot, actually.
Well, no, I wouldn't see it that way. As a commercial nurseryman, if I could get 50 or 100 out of that pot, I'd be far happier.
Evil face of capitalism, Stephen,
no,
right.
It's just the way I spread these plants around amongst other enthusiasts. So I divide them up into a decent sized clump.
Yeah.
I would do it, generally speaking, in that sort of late winter into early spring, just as the plants are about to start shooting.
Yeah.
Immaterial of whether they're evergreen or deciduous ones, I tend to cut all the leaves off that are on it from the previous season when I divide. Means it's easier to work out where you're cutting.
Oh, okay.
And you're going to get a whole crop of new leaves and things coming up. And it also gives the disturbed rhizomes and broken roots and things a chance to re-establish before they've got to support a new crop of leaves. So I cut all the leaves off, chop it up into 4 or 5 or 6 pieces, depending on how big a clump it is.
Yeah.
Pot them up into individual pots or spread them out in the garden to make a wider drift, and away you go again.
Now, Stephen, I see there's something in your hands that you need to share.
I have the need. I didn't notice this one till we'd almost finished filming, and this is one of my favourite epimediums. It's rather lurid in colour. It's pink and yellow, which is not something I'd normally put together. But because the flowers are small and dainty, I don't think it matters too much. It has a nice bright green leaf.
Yeah.
It's a cultivar or a hybrid that has been produced called Mardi Gras. Now, the reason I particularly like this one isn't because of its name, but another thing that epimediums should and will do more of, I'm sure, is have an extended flowering season. And Mardi Gras is one of those that I find, at least in my own garden, has flowers on it probably longer than any of the other epimedium cultivars. So it's another
quiver to the bow.
Well, it is, yeah. So it's something that I hope that the breeders are working with. So if they want longevity of flowers, which is always a good thing, I think, in most plants, then you could use Mardi Gras as a parent, and hopefully that sort of long flowering period might well go into some of its progeny in different colours.
So let's talk about the species then. How long would a species flower last, roughly?
Roughly, you'll get about 4 weeks, so about a month out of most epimediums in flower. Some will have sporadic flowering over a longer period.
Yeah. But Mardi Gras, how long?
2 to 3 months.
Oh, right.
So
A long
certainly
time.
in my own garden, this one always flowers well after the other ones are basically all finished.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. That is very, very beautiful. I must say, I was a bit ambivalent about epimediums, but as ever, Stephen, you have opened my eyes.
Oh, I hope so.
And I'm not going to go home empty-handed, but they are very, very beautiful. What I love is that they do look fantastic in pots.
Oh, they do. And the foliage is good
Yeah.
for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So they pay their way. I mean, I like plants that persist in doing interesting
You
things.
frequently say this, Stephen, they've got to pay their way.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to Craig here at Gentiana Nursery. Now, Craig does have an e-com site, so you can, if you're in Australia, buy his epimediums online.
Yep.
Now, unfortunately, no Australian grower can ship overseas, and Craig can't ship to the quarantine states in Australia. Otherwise, though, go for it.
Or come and visit Craig's
Yes.
nursery. I mean, it's so much more fun to arrive in a nursery and find that plant you didn't know you needed.
Which happens to me
Yes.
all the time, Stephen Ryan. You're a very bad influence.
Yep.
Now, if you want to know what we're doing next week, you're going to have to hit subscribe.
Yes. And don't forget that every Monday we do our shorts. So if you've got a burning horticultural question you'd like to ask me that I can manage to answer in 60 seconds, don't forget to tell me where you're from, and we will pop up some of those questions every Monday. So join us for that as well.
Yes, now we've made quite a few films here at Gentiana, and I will put them all in a playlist and link it below. Gentiana is a specialist in perennials, in species shrubs, small bulb and alpine plants, so do feel free to peruse the whole collection, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.